morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alison Keith, and I'm the director of the Jackman Humanities Institute here at the University of Toronto. Welcome to our Public Humanities Workshop on Intelligence in the Absence of Life, organized by Teresa Heffernan, Professor of English Language and Literature at St. Mary's University in Halifax, and the 2023-2024 Visiting Public Humanities Fellow at the JHI. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event, recognizing that we're gathering here today on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Métis people. The City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. While the Toronto Purchase was signed for this parcel of land, we know that the Mississaugas were not properly compensated, and that more land was taken from them than originally agreed upon. The Jackman Humanities Institute also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. The JHI is indeed a tri-campus endeavor with programming at all three of the university's locations, and so we have participated in making absent Indigenous peoples all across this part of Toronto. Our governance includes deans from 10 divisions, and the heart of our activities each year revolves around an annual theme. This year we've been studying the theme of absence. Absence as loss, abandonment, omission. Absence as exile, separation, and unbelonging. Absence as void, silence, privation, and gap. My land acknowledgement resonates within the multiple fields of absence, and Teresa's own research on the science and fiction of robotics and AI addresses many of them too, and she thereby offers an important challenge to the AI hype cycle. The JHI's Public Humanities Workshops were established in 2019 with the support of the Mellon Foundation in order to showcase the exciting public engagement research being conducted in the humanities and qualitative social sciences at the University of Toronto. And our speakers today exemplify the best of what we do and sponsor. For that reason, I would ask you please to mute your devices before the workshop begins. The talks are being recorded, but not the Q&A sessions, which Teresa will moderate. At the end of the day, everyone is invited to the closing reception here in JHB 100, at which there will be an opportunity for informal conversation with our speakers. Teresa Heffernan has organized the intellectual feast in store for us today, and before I turn the floor over to her, I'd just like to introduce her briefly, or as briefly as her lengthy CV allows. The author of 3 academic monographs, she's also edited a scholarly edition of letters, and most recently, a collection of articles on cyborg futures, cross-disciplinary perspectives on robotics and AI. Her current book project, entitled Where AI Meets Fiction, addresses the tension in the field of AI between the claim of mimicking human intelligence and creativity and its elision of both the materiality of resource-intensive machines and the business of AI. If the AI industry has long marketed the idea that there's no difference between the human and the machine by appealing to overly literal readings of fictions, Teresa's project reclaims fiction as fiction to investigate the question of creativity and intelligence in the absence of life. Please join me in welcoming Professor Teresa Heffernan.
Thank you, Alison, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Jackman Humanities Institute for supporting this research, and to my fellow fellows, several who are here, who have helped create this vibrant space for critical thinking, and also to Monica Toffoli, who's the office administrator, and Sonia Johnson, who's the communications officer, for all their help organizing this event. So I'll just welcome everyone, and just a few housekeeping items before I introduce the first speaker. Each speaker will present for about 45 to 50 minutes. followed by a discussion. We'll have a 15-minute break for coffee between the two morning speakers, and then we'll break for lunch at 12:30. The afternoon session will begin at 1:45. All the talks, as Alison said, will be recorded and they'll be available in a few weeks. Unfortunately, the second speaker, Elke Swartz, had a family emergency and had to return to Germany, but she's kindly offered to present via Zoom, so we have her set up. Okay, so let me introduce Paris Marx, who's a Canadian technology journalist, author, and podcaster. His work has appeared in places like Time, Wired, NBC News, and other publications, and his articles have been translated into several languages. He turned his MA thesis at McGill into the book Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. And you can follow his award-winning podcast called Tech Won't Save Us. I know some of you know about it. And subscribe to his newsletter, Disconnect, which is really a fantastic resource. Critical of the Silicon Valley marketing machine, his work exposes the gaping holes in techno-optimist stories about the future, which so often obscure things like labor exploitation and the unsustainable environmental infrastructure on which the AI machine is built. His talk today is on why we shouldn't buy the AI fantasy. So please help me in welcoming Paris.
Thanks so much, Teresa. I'm going to grab a bottle of water and then we'll get into it. So it's great to join you all this morning to talk about AI, and of course throughout the day we'll be talking about it a bit more. So yeah, we'll be talking about why we shouldn't be buying the AI fantasy, getting into all of that. And so I want to start with a little scenario for you all. So, imagine there's a chatbot that's released, some journalists have a chat with it and publish the transcripts in major news organizations. People interact with it and think they're having these really in-depth, meaningful discussions with, this AI tool. A group of people say that it heralds this future where computers are going to match the capabilities of humans. And along with that, the creator talks about, or the creators talk about how, it presents this big threat to the future of humanity. You might be thinking, oh, that's ChatGPT, right? We saw it released November of 2022. But I would say no, actually. That is Eliza, that was released in 1966 by Joseph Weizenbaum, which was the first chatbot, very early on, not generative AI as we would hear about it discussed today, but still something that had a big impact in its time and in the discussions of the types of technologies that we use and what they might mean for us. So Weizenbaum was originally from Germany, but ended up at MIT in the United States, and he was not initially a tech critic, right? He was very enthusiastic about technology. He created this chatbot, of course, and many other things, and was excited about what technology could mean for the world. But when he created this chatbot and he released it and he saw the way that people reacted to it, it started to change how he thought about, how people interact with these technologies and what they might mean for the world. And in particular, he told this story about how he showed, I think it was his assistant, one of his colleagues, Eliza, and had her interact with it, and eventually she asked him to leave the room because she felt she was having this really meaningful conversation because it was designed to, kind of mimic a psychiatrist, right? Which was something easy to do at the time because, he felt, it's just kind of asking you a question based on what you say to it, so it's not really hard to code and put it together, especially at this time. So that was, kind of the early chatbot to get us into this discussion that we've been having over the past year, as though it's this kind of novel thing, but actually it's something that's been around for quite a long time. And so if we think about the birth of artificial intelligence, this is John McCarthy, who is often referred to as one of the fathers of AI. He coined the term in 1956 as something that would be distinct from cybernetics, which was already this kind of existing field and this term that was well recognized at the time. And in 1958, he launched the Artificial Intelligence Project with Marvin Minsky. And so if you think about, what is in that term, right? There's kind of an ideological expression in that term of what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to create an intelligence that is artificial, right? That is computational. And within that is the belief that something like that is even possible in the first place. Of course, that project was set up with funding from the military, as many things were at the time, because the military saw a lot of potential uses in these types of technologies. And as I say, it had this idea that computation could eventually reach this point where it would replicate the human mind, right? And where a computer could not only become equal to a human, but could surpass it, right? Which has been part of the narrative and the discussion for quite a long time. And so this set up quite a divide, right, between someone like McCarthy, who really believed that a computer could replicate a human, that you could recreate the human mind and human intelligence within a computer, and then someone like Weizenbaum, who became this critic, and after creating ELIZA and seeing the response to it, which he called which was later called the ELIZA effect, not by him in particular, I believe. But he became this critic who, for the rest of his life, spoke out about these technologies and the potential impact that they could have, and kind of warned people about them. McCarthy, in particular, there's this interesting quote. He says, "Every aspect of learning or any feature of intelligence can, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it." Marvin Minsky was much more direct, and he said, "Human brain is just a, quote, meat machine." So this is kind of how they saw the human mind and its potential to be replicated by computers. But of course, as we know, from those early periods right to now, AI has been on this kind of boom and bust cycle, as there have been breakthroughs and things like that, and then there have been what are called AI winters, right? And we've been through this many times before. We're now, of course, at one of these peaks where the hype is kind of at its max. But that doesn't mean that it's going to change the world, just like every other time before when people have said that. So let's look at what happened in late 2022 when ChatGPT was released. You might recognize a graphic like this. It was one of the things that was used when ChatGPT came out to say that it was this thing that's going to transform everything, right? And the tech industry loves to use these sorts of graphics to say, look at how quickly people are adopting our new technology. That must mean that it is important, right? That it has significance because people are using it. Of course, it was a system that was immediately picked up by the media, that had a lot of hype behind it, that people were talking about on social media, that was free and easy to access. All you had to do was go onto the website. So why wouldn't people just go on and give it a shot, right? To hit 1 million users. So it launches in November of 2022. It has this rapid growth, and of course the media is immediately interested in this. The tech industry is very good at getting the media to pay attention to what it is doing and to, repeat the narratives that it has around the particular technologies that it creates and the potential impacts that they might have on society. And of course those narratives were combined with this idea that generative AI was going to change everything, right? It was this kind of break with what had happened before, and we were moving into this new era of computation. There was these discussions that it was like the release of the internet, or the privatization and commercialization of the internet again, right? This moment where everything changed after. It's this real marker. Of course, that works very well for the companies that are creating the technology to have us believe that. And of course, as a result of that, what we have seen over the past year and a half is this scramble for other companies to say that they are rolling out generative AI features so that they can get not only the public interest, but the markets excited, get their investors excited, get their share prices to have a little bit of a bump as a result of that. Some are more successful than others in achieving it. But of course, this is something that we see time and again with the tech industry, where just a few years ago they were all trying to show how they were implementing crypto and adding crypto features to their business models, because that was the exciting thing at the time. Of course, now when we talk about ChatGPT, or when we talk about generative AI, there are a lot of interested people who have different things to say about it. You might recognize some of these folks. I think the one on the bottom will be most recognizable. But of course, Sam Altman is just above him. He's the CEO of OpenAI at times. At other times he's not. And then, of course, at the top is Mark Andreessen, who is a prominent venture capitalist at Andreessen Horowitz. And so supporters of generative AI and these particular narratives say that AI will increase human intelligence, right? So think about going back to John McCarthy and his, belief that a computer and a human mind were one and the same, right? And that a computer could eventually replicate what a human mind was doing. They're essentially saying, or the supporters of this say, okay, so since these things are equal and since the human mind can be replicated by these computers, what is eventually going to happen is now that we have these technologies, human intelligence itself can take a step up, and we'll all kind of benefit from that because we're increasing the total amount of intelligence that's out there. Someone like, to a certain degree, Sam Altman, but particularly Mark Andreessen, argues that this is going to allow for a proliferation of AI helpers, right? So we're going to have all these assistants. Everything that we do is going to have an AI assistant. It's going to allow us to become so much more productive and, all this sort of stuff. So, there's a lot of hype about the potential of what this could potentially mean. And of course, they talk about it potentially replacing some of the work that is done by humans, can now be done by AI, generative AI, these different tools. And, in some industries, we've seen that be much more real, something that it presents much more of a threat. In other industries, it's a bit more hype, and we'll talk a bit more about that. One of the things that Sam Altman points to in particular, one of these narratives that's really useful to him is that it will these generative AI tools, because they're going to be so intelligent and, so capable and replicating what humans are doing, that they'll be able to, basically improve access to education and healthcare, because now you won't need a teacher, you won't need a doctor, you'll be able to talk to this generative AI assistant and it will help you and do all this, all on their own. Of course, when Sam Altman was asked directly if he would use one of these doctors, he said, no, I'm still using my doctor. That's for the pores, right? But there's also the presentation of the risk here, right? And that is the risk that these tools will gain general intelligence, which means, kind of meeting that level of human intelligence and then exceeding it. And then, the potential is that, it's going to, become smarter than humans, and then it's going to want to oppress us, right? And it's going to hate us, and it's going to want to wipe humanity out, potentially, if we don't treat it properly and if we don't say the nice and right things right now, and it picks up on that later. There's a whole, world of conspiracism that encounters their belief in generative AI intelligence, general intelligence, and what that would potentially mean and what the AIs might do to us that are, I would say, heavily inspired by science fiction movies and not so much the reality of what this might mean. And so what actually made this possible, right? Because obviously we have gotten to this point where these tools are created. These people in the industry would tell us that this is just because this is a significant break with what happened before. Everything has now changed. But actually, we can see the movement in this direction over the course of, at least 15 years, if not longer, where in the early 2000s, we saw the creation or the beginning of the creation of all this kind of centralized computing power in these massive data centers that we now call kind of cloud computing. Of course, pioneered largely by Amazon Web Services, but Google and Microsoft are other big providers. There are, of course, some Chinese companies that are very involved in this as well. And there's this mass expansion of data centers happening right now that we can talk about a bit more. Along with that is, of course, the massive data collection. So after kind of what is often termed Web 1.0, which basically ended once the dot-com boom collapsed in around 2000, the tech industry moved into this era where it was focused on collecting a lot of data on people, right? Which is obviously a big part of the conversation today when we talk about social media platforms and everything else that many of these tech companies are doing. Of course, this goes far beyond social media platforms and search engines now, to the degree that a lot of modern cars collect a ton of data on what you do in your car and sends that back to data brokers and manufacturers and all this sort of stuff. So they've created this vast kind of apparatus and infrastructure in order to collect all of this data, and so that also feeds into these systems. And then, of course, it's just immense amounts of capital, not just to build this computing infrastructure, but to be able to fund the development of these tools, because generative AI is incredibly expensive. There was an estimate sometime last year that if you did a regular Google search and then did a similar search with kind of a generative AI tool like one released by Google, that it's actually 10 times more expensive to kind of do that sort of search instead. None of these companies are actually making money with generative AI right now. It's this push, right? And so you have the combination of these three factors, which leads us to where we are today, where we have the release of these generative AI tools, and it's a progression along this path where the capabilities of these tools that these companies have been creating have been getting more powerful over this period because they've been able to draw on more computation, more data, more capital in order to get to the point where we are today. And of course, going back to the boom and the bust just for a second, we see this a lot in the tech industry, and the AI boom is no different, as I showed you with the chart earlier, where we have had a lot of this through the course of AI, where AI has experienced these breakthroughs, or there have been changes in the way that it's used, and that has resulted in a new period of hype and excitement, and a lot of promises or a lot of claims about the potential promise that it creates. And then, of course, we head back into a winter when those things don't really pay off in the way that the boosters and the hype folks suggest. So the tech industry always needs something to drive new investment, right? One thing that the author Malcolm Harris, who wrote this book last year called Palo Alto, explains is that after the dot-com boom and bust, so the internet is privatized in 1995, there's a ton of capital that floods into the space in that point, and a bunch of companies and a bunch of people get really rich because there's a lot of excitement about what this new kind of market might mean. That after that, Malcolm Harris argues that it's not that they learned never to do that again, but rather to keep doing it time and again and just know when to get out, right? Keep doing these booms, keep doing these kind of cycles of hype, know when it has reached its peak so that the investors can get out, so that you know when to IPO, and then put the losses on somebody else. And they've been, for the most part, quite successful in doing that. Some of them not so successful, of course. And of course, before the AI boom, the one that immediately preceded this when we were talking about hype is, of course, crypto and the metaverse. A few years ago, crypto was going to completely transform the financial system and was going to empower everybody with these new financial tools. Of course, what we actually saw was a ton of scams. Sam Bankman-Fried was just sent to jail for, I think it was 25 years. So that's where that kind of ended up. Of course, we've seen a recent spike in crypto prices again recently. But there's a lot of hot air behind that, not so much tangible improvements. And of course, at the same time as this was happening, as these previous hype cycles around crypto and the metaverse were declining, we also saw a significant rise in interest rates, right? And the tech industry has been very reliant on low interest rates and easy access to capital since, the post-2008 period. And so faced with that difficulty, they needed something else to kind of keep the industry going, right? And to drive a new wave of investment at a very time when their traditional means of accessing capital were drying up. And so, of course, generative AI emerges right in that moment to fill this void where you have this uncertainty and you need to make it through to the period when you get to interest rates cuts again, and the industry can take advantage of that. And so, of course, that's what AI has delivered for them. And of course, it's driven that new wave of investment that they have expected. And just as I was saying, this is a quote from Malcolm Harris. So he says, the true moral of the dot-com bubble was go big fast, keep labor and fixed costs low, time your exit. For this cohort of wealthy tech guys, the inescapable structural historic lesson of the dot-com bubble was do the dot-com bubble again. And of course, this is just a chart that shows the dot-com boom and bust. So you see this kind of massive spike. And then March of 2000, it starts to really drop off. And you have a lot of companies being completely destroyed in that time. But you also had a lot of people who made a whole lot of money and that funded everything that they wanted to do next into the post-dot-com period. And so I think in order to contextualize what we're seeing now, it's important to talk about the last AI hype cycle because it shows I think it helps to show that a lot of the claims that we're seeing now are not things that we should be buying into and believing because the tech industry has the incentive to basically say these things, right? And so you might remember in the mid-2010s, there was a lot of hype around AI. Robots were going to take our jobs. AI was going to automate the writers and, all these sorts of people out of work. A lot of fear that we'd lose almost half of jobs within a certain number of years. These sorts of narratives were repeated a lot in that period. There were talk of burger flipping robots that were going to wipe out all the fast food workers. Last I checked, they're still in there. All the truck drivers and taxi drivers were going to be gone in a few years because self-driving cars were right around the corner. I haven't seen many of those either. And of course, these other kind of humanoid robots were going to replace us in a whole load of other sectors. I was talking to somebody last year who was talking about the kind of promise of these replacing a lot of elder care workers, of course, because that is becoming much more important, healthcare workers, things like that. That never happened either. So basically what we saw is that the tech did not work out as planned, or at least as the industry promised us it would and claimed it would in this moment, right? When they really got us to buy into these narratives that they had around, what this moment of automation and AI was going to mean for us in the mid-2010s. They promised that there was this massive investment in, fixed capital, basically, that was happening at the time, in all of these businesses to build out this automation capacity. But actually what we saw in the 2010s was, in the United States, some of the most sluggish productivity growth that we've seen in decades, and indeed the most sluggish productivity growth, because that investment, despite the claims that it was happening, was not actually happening. There was not this massive investment in kind of new automation tools and things like that in order to make businesses more productive. Instead, what actually happened was that tech was turned against workers, right? So you had this big promise that tech was going to wipe out all the workers. That is a very effective tool for bosses and management to say, now don't ask us for much more, because if not, we'll wipe out your job, right? In particular, the gig economy with companies like Uber was a major way that this happened. Of course, Uber was very much a pioneer, but then a lot of other companies adopted similar labor tactics. So Uber moved into this, industry where there were quite strict regulations on how taxis would operate, the number of taxis that were on the road, the fare that people would pay, which guaranteed a certain amount of a wage to the people who were delivering that service. And they basically moved in and they said, we're not a transportation company, we're a technology company, so we shouldn't have to follow any of these rules. We should be able to set the price that people pay, the wages that drivers receive, the number of people on the road. That should all be completely up to us, and everyone else should bear the costs of this business model that we are creating, right? As a result of that, of course, those workers were denied basic labor protections, had very little recourse against what the company was doing to them. People who worked in the taxi industry saw their industry not completely decimated, but significantly affected by the fact that these companies were basically transforming the business model. In food delivery as well, these same tactics were applied where people don't have employment rights, they don't have the right to unionization, they don't have a minimum wage right. In some jurisdictions, things like that have been added, but largely, the workers still describe that they have very little recourse against this company and the way that it has transformed the labor model. And what we've seen is that a lot of other companies over time have sought to try to replicate this as much as possible, or shift aspects of their businesses onto platforms like this, where they can try to pay their workers less, not have to deal with unionization, all this sort of stuff. Another company, of course, that did this was Amazon, very notably. Now, Amazon is not completely like a gig model. Some of that is. Some of its package delivery explicitly uses that model. But usually it does have employees. But still, it transformed the labor model of how that work was done. So warehousing, of course, is traditionally a unionized industry where people make a pretty good wage to do the work that they do. Not the case in an Amazon warehouse, where you're quite close to minimum wage. You are not getting the benefits of unionization. The company will fight you tooth and nail if you try to unionize. In its delivery partner service, so it used to rely on Canada Post, UPS, FedEx, these sorts of providers. Increasingly, it has built out its own network of fulfillment, of delivery people, but that works very differently from, say, Canada Post or UPS, which are unionized. Instead, it relies on companies that set up as delivery service partners to cover particular areas of a city. All of those companies are individually contracted with. Those workers are, They're contract workers. They're not unionized. And in the cases where these workers, these delivery workers, have tried to unionize, Amazon has canceled the contracts with those delivery service partners to basically say, don't any of you try the same thing, because we will make sure you lose your jobs as well. They've also been building out an air freight service, of course, Prime Air. They can't get around the pilots' unions there, but the pilots who participate in that program, who work for these companies that deliver this service, because Amazon doesn't run it itself, say that the wages are significantly lower than other sorts of work that they do, right? So basically what we see there is this transformation of the way that this work is done. These industries that are traditionally unionized, where people get paid well, basically being eradicated, people getting paid much less, people having much less power over the work that they do, because Amazon implements very strict algorithmic management practices, so that you need to deliver a certain number of packages or package a certain number of products in the warehouse, which leads workers with very little time to, say, use the bathroom or take a break or anything like that, right? So basically what we saw was algorithmic management in that process, in that last period of AI hype, rather than robots actually taking the jobs. What we see now is actually not so dissimilar. Even though we have these generative AI tools that, you go onto the website, you access them, it seems like the computer is just churning all this out and doing it all itself. It's the case that there's actually a lot of human labor still involved in this process. So Time Magazine reported, I think this was the beginning of last year, January of 2023, about Kenyan workers who make about $2 an hour in order to label, the kind of content that comes out of ChatGPT, well, that goes into and then, of course, later comes out of ChatGPT, because, of course, these tools are trained on a whole load of things that are just scraped off of the internet. And as we all know, there's a lot of really vile things out there on the internet if you just completely scrape it and put it into your tool. And so these workers, like many content moderation workers who work for Facebook and other social media platforms and things like that as well, had to look through some of, the most the worst aspects of humanity, to see that for 12 to 14 hours a day, and that was basically their job. And they were contract workers. They were not hired directly by OpenAI, of course, to do this work. They were not provided with mental health support. So imagine looking at this kind of stuff for 12 hours a day, ingesting all of that, then having to go home and process it and still live your life. They were, of course, laid off when that work was done. And when journalists went back and spoke to them, they explained how doing this work that now powers one of the most high-tech tools in many years, destroyed their lives in many cases. Destroyed relationships, made it difficult for them to do other work, made it difficult for them just to engage in their everyday lives, because of all of the terrible things that they had to see through the course of doing this work for this company that is now valued incredibly highly, but left these people behind. And it's not just OpenAI, and it's not just Kenyan workers. What we see is, of course, in China, stories about them relying on student interns. This is quite common in China, where student interns have been brought in to make iPhones and stuff at Foxconn factories as well. Now they're, of course, doing the work of labeling generative AI models. In Finland, they've talked about using prisoners to train AI, or rather have been. And of course, we just see more broadly that, when we talk about the transformation of labor, say in the mid-2010s, there was also this transformation where there was the creation of a lot of micro work. So a lot of people who do very small tasks for even pennies on platforms like Clickworker or Amazon Mechanical Turk, in order to label these AI tools, not just generative AI, but more broadly. There are stories about, say, Venezuelan workers doing the work of labeling Tesla's self-driving data so that its models can keep training off of that. So many of the AI tools, supposed AI tools that you interact with on a daily basis, are often reliant on very poorly paid labor from all around the world. There was another one I remember from during the pandemic. Uber was, making sure that, not just checking people's faces to make sure that their license matched who they were, but also to make sure that they were wearing a mask while they were doing the work as like a safety feature. And of course, Uber promoted that as, our AI tool is checking to make sure. Actually, it was sending all those to these poorly paid workers doing this click work in order to check to make sure that the photos matched one another, right? But it was promoted as AI. This is very common practice. And so, of course, when we think about the implications of these tools, it's not just labor impacts, but also environmental impacts that are getting, much greater attention. And of course, that's because, when you go on to OpenAI's website, when you go to use ChatGPT, you put your little prompt into the box, whether it's Bard or ChatGPT or whatever. There's always computers that are powering that, right? And usually there are massive data centers, which are like, warehouses of servers that rely on a lot of resources in order to make that work, not to mention computer parts. What we see right now is that there's a massive expansion in the works of hyperscale data centers. So these are the really large data centers that companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft build that's happening around the world, on pace to triple over the next 6 years. Along with that is a massive increase in electricity demand in order to power those data centers, and of course all of those tools that rely on that computing power. In Ireland right now, 18% of the energy of the entire country goes into powering data centers, and it's predicted that will hit 33% by 2030. So we're seeing a lot of opposition there, but in many other countries to what's happening. And of course, there's also the water use that comes along with this, because when you have all these computers packed in this enclosed space, it needs to be cooled as well. Some of that in some places is done with energy, with electricity, but in other places it relies heavily on water. And companies like Microsoft and Google are using billions of gallons of water. I can't remember if it's billions and trillions off the top of my head, but they're using a lot of water, okay, in order to keep these things cooled down. The other thing I would say about this as well is, just as, in places like Ireland, people are protesting against and even opposing the creation and building of new data centers based on energy use, in other parts of the world that's happening based on water use. I was speaking to an academic who does work on this earlier this year, Stephen Lehude. He's based at KCL in London. And he's from Chile, and he was speaking to this community in Santiago that's been opposing a Google data center. And that is because their access to water is very precarious. The community in particular that this data center is proposed for used to rely on water trucks for a long time, but quite recently got access to water through pipes. And they're concerned because the company has not been forthright and not been open and not been informing them and telling them about what its requirements would be. They're worried that if this data center was built in their community, that they would be forced back onto relying on water trucks instead of getting piped water into their homes. And so this is like the real difference that this can make to communities around the world when these data centers are built. And people like Sam Altman don't really care about that so much. So when he was at the World Economic Forum in January of this year, this is a quote from an interview with Bloomberg. He said, "We do need way more energy in the world than I think we thought we needed before. We still don't appreciate the energy needs of this technology. I still expect, unfortunately, the world is on a path where we're going to have to do something dramatic with climate, like geoengineering, as a stopgap." So his argument is that we need all these generative AI tools. It needs to be absolutely everywhere. And the cost of that, we're just going to have to bear whatever it is. He says in order to power all these tools that he wants to roll out into the world, we're going to need an energy breakthrough in nuclear technology in particular to power it. But if that doesn't happen in time, we can just geoengineer the planet, as though that is not a huge concern. Of course, that's something that Bill Gates advocates as well. He's a big fan of geoengineering. And as I was saying, around the world, we're seeing these increasingly large protests and opposition to data centers being built. The top left here is Ireland, where they have a very strong movement against data centers. In Dublin, they have actually had moratoriums against the building of data centers there. Singapore, the Netherlands, in Amsterdam has also put in moratoriums against data centers. Of course, this is people in the Netherlands here, people in, I think it's Virginia in the United States, down here on the bottom left, where they're opposing data centers as well. And then, of course, there we go. And then, of course, this is Uruguay here as well. So opposition in Chile, but also in Uruguay. There's opposition in France, South Africa, New Zealand, all over the world. This kind of opposition to data centers is growing because people are concerned about energy use, they're concerned about water use, and they're also concerned in places like New Zealand whether it makes sense to, they're trying to hit their climate targets, right? They're trying to move their grid over to renewable energy, and if they build all these data centers that aren't really for domestic local use, but to kind of power the international businesses of these major tech conglomerates, that makes it harder for them to reach their climate goals. And they're like, does this really make sense to us? It's not creating a lot of jobs. You don't need a ton of people to keep a data center going. So yeah, these are questions that a lot of people are increasingly asking. And this kind of brings us back to intelligence, right? So of course you'll know Sam Altman, but here on the left, this is Emily Bender. She is an academic at the University of Washington, and she is one of the people who wrote this paper that uses this term stochastic parrots, right, to refer to AI models. There is this belief someone like Sam Altman would want you to think that you're speaking to this and you're speaking to this like a chatbot, and it is understanding you, and it's kind of having this conversation with you. And Emily Bender would say, no, it's like a parrot kind of repeating back, what you're kind of saying to it. Ted Chiang, the science fiction author, says it is autocomplete on steroids, these sorts of generative AI tools, right? And I think that's a much more accurate representation of what is going on there. But basically, in the same way that I kind of put Joseph Weizenbaum and John McCarthy next to each other, these are sort of the different perspectives on AI that we're seeing right now, right? Where on the one side you have the tech CEO who is saying that this tool is everything, we're a few years away from it reaching the level where it's going to meet human intelligence and potentially even exceed it, and then we need to think about the potential implications of all of that. And then on the other hand, we have people who are very knowledgeable about this technology, like someone like Professor Emily Bender is, and are saying, hold on a minute, this does not mean that a large language model understands anything in particular. It's just been trained on a lot of data. There's a lot of computation behind it, so it allows it to do things that these tools haven't necessarily done before, have these additional capabilities, but that doesn't mean it's understanding anything, right? That doesn't mean that there's an intelligence below it that is nascent, that is growing. It just means that there's more computer power, more data that is, making this tool work, right? And of course, Sam Altman has not ignored this. He tweeted not long after the release of ChatGPT, "I am a stochastic parrot, and so are you." And this is part of what these boosters like to do, right? It's not just to say that the computer is close to human intelligence, but it's to diminish human intelligence to make it seem closer to a computer. And I think that has a lot of real concerning implications. I think when we look at ChatGPT and we look at generative AI, we can see that the boom is already starting to kind of peter out. This is usage numbers, visit numbers for ChatGPT, I think in the United States. And worldwide, sorry. And we see in both cases that usage has been declining. And it kind of reached a peak and then sort of to drop off. We've also seen growing concerns about the profitability of these tools. Now that we are well over a year into this hype cycle, investors are starting to ask, wait, where's the money here, right? We can see the share prices go up, this is great, we've had this kind of benefit, but where is the business model behind it? Because one of the good things you can potentially say is after about 10 years where they didn't care about profits, they are starting to ask, okay, where's the real business model behind some of these companies now, right? When you had Uber operate for 15 years without a profit, some of these investors are not willing to let that stuff happen anymore. And then of course you also see kind of movements in stocks away from Taiwan, which is a key semiconductor manufacturer, which you need a lot of in order to power these sorts of data centers and these sorts of tools. So we're seeing kind of shifts in the stock market that suggest this thing is kind of potentially hit its peak. And so to kind of start to close off, I want to read this quote by Ursula Le Guin, which I think is very relevant to today, even though she said it in 2014. She said, "Hard times are coming when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality." And I think that is important to consider in the context of this kind of generative AI moment, because it questions what these technologies are actually doing and what kind of future they're leading us toward. When we think about generative AI, it's not intelligent, as we were talking about, or at least I wouldn't say so. Instead, what it is doing is it is taking all of this data that exists out there, all these things that have been written in the past, all this work that has been done in the past, it is feeding it into this model and then seeking to churn out things based on it, right? So it's taking the past and then, churning out things based on the past, right? It can't create something new. It can't, in the way that we would potentially or hopefully argue that a human does, really create new visual styles, new writing styles, have some new way of seeing the world that helps to inform the rest of us and think about, the types of conversations that we have. It really looks to, especially when we think about art, ensure that art is for commercial purposes, right, rather than human enrichment. So one of the things about a lot of these more intangible fields, of course, it's part of what the Writers Guild and the actors were fighting about last year, and what IATSE, which represents the below-the-line workers in the film industry, and the Teamsters are fighting about this year. Their contracts are in negotiation right now. Is that, they want to protect the work that humans do in creating these sorts of, entertainment is even the wrong word, these sorts of artistic expressions, these sorts of pieces of writing that help humans to think about the world that we have around us, right? I think that this is a uniquely sort of human thing that we do. And these generative AI tools, they recognize, and I think, the capital behind them recognizes that it's tough to always quantify these sorts of things, right? When we're thinking about the sorts of human benefits that we get from engaging with culture, it's not always easy to capture that and to make a profit off of it. But if you can absorb all of those things into a model, and if you can tell people that the future of culture and creativity is whatever is churned out of this model, then it's much easier to capitalize on that and to turn it into a business, right? And so, of course, that is part of what artists were fighting about when it came to these AI tools last year, and wanting to ensure that there were regulations on how that was implemented in their fields, thinking back to what happened in the mid-2010s and the promises of that moment, and, the argument that AI and robots were going to replace everybody, and then how it was used in order to transform the way that labor was done so that workers had less power over their labor. They could see that coming for them because they already experienced it with the shift to streaming and how that transformed their business model, their industry, and said, if these AI tools are going to be present in our industry, even if this is really hyped up and they're not going to have the impact that the companies are claiming, then we need to have rules on how they're rolled out so that we still control the labor that we're doing, so that it's still the human that's at the center of doing this, and I think set a real precedent for other workers and other industries thinking about how these tools can potentially be rolled out. And that brings us back to Joseph Weizenbaum. He's much older in this photo, of course. I figured that was appropriate. Fortunately, he's no longer with us. But in his 1976 book, Computer Power and Human Reason, From Judgment to Calculation, he basically talked about this difference, right? What can a computer do and what shouldn't a computer do in talking about this divide? And so he basically says that judgment, judging another human, requires values, right? Whereas computation is entirely different from that. And those values are derived from human experiences. Whereas since computers are not human, they do not have those experiences that we have as humans, and thus they don't develop this set of values that we have, right? And it's not as easy to just code that into some sort of model. Computers, rather, are great for calculation, right? They're great at calculating these sorts of things, at putting all this stuff together, but they should never be used to judge a human being, because that is not something that they are developed to do. They do not have the values in order to do that, and of course, it allows people to use them for harm. There's a risk that people who are powerful can then use AI, can use the prospect of, these technologies in order to shirk their responsibility when they are implementing them in such a way as to really harm, the humans on the other end, right? And so we see plenty of that. already happening. In Australia, you may be familiar with this, maybe you're not. They had a massive robo-debt scandal, they called it. So an AI system was rolled out in their welfare system, and basically forced a ton of people, or claimed that a ton of people who were on welfare actually weren't deserving of it, and forced them off of it, canceled their payments, and said, if you want to get access again, you need to prove to us that we were wrong, rather than the other way around. They eventually had to pay out billions, or $1.8 billion as a result of that, but a lot of people were significantly harmed as a result of being forced off of their benefits. People committed suicide as a result of it. These are the real kind of human harms that you can see from these things, right? When a computer is used to judge a human, and people in power use that as an excuse not to, or to justify these cuts that they want to do and these things that can really hurt people. In the Netherlands, there was a similar scandal over using algorithms in order to, rolling them out in welfare systems and social service systems. We see more broadly how these things can be used in very discriminatory ways in immigration systems as well, where obviously I think we're quite familiar at this point how a lot of these AI tools have built-in discrimination because they're trained off of the discriminatory society that we live in. And of course, then when they're rolled out in immigration systems, they often deny people from certain countries, particular backgrounds, particular races, visas more often than other types of people, and more than you would regularly see in these sorts of systems. And of course, there's also the risk that these things are being rolled out in Canada right now, and we'll be dealing with the potential implications of that into the future. The government just announced a big strategy yesterday, I believe, to roll out a ton of new money in order to implement AI tools into all aspects of Canadian life, because they're very big on growing the Canadian AI industry, which of course Toronto is a big center for. And so basically what we see with these scandals, and there are many, many more around the world, is that these AI tools are already being rolled out in the delivery of social services, of healthcare, of immigration systems and visas and things like that. They're already having very significant impacts. But even though we keep seeing these scandals, governments keep doing it and not learning from what has happened in the past. It doesn't mean that these bureaucracies, that these programs are not difficult to deliver, but the question is, how should these tools actually be rolled out in those scenarios? And that, of course, brings me to the end. If we're thinking about AI, if we're thinking about these technologies, especially as they're supposedly becoming more powerful and there's this push to roll them out in more places, the question is really, first of all, what can an AI do? Is it actually intelligent in the way that these people who develop the tools want us to believe? Or what is the actual capability and what are they actually good for when we're thinking about how they can be rolled out? And then beyond that, it's not just a question of what they can do, but what should they do? What is ethical, what is acceptable for us as human beings to have these tools do? Do we want, all the creative jobs to be automated and then all the humans go do the manual labor? Or is that not the vision that we have for our society? Ultimately, we're often told that these technologies are inevitable, right? Once they're created, they're just going to roll out and we have no say over that. But that's not true. We do have a say. We can make rules. We can make decisions around how these technologies are used in our world, in our society. And I think the writers and actors last year showed that in a very small way in their own industry, in saying we don't accept this idea that the studios should just decide or the tech companies should decide exactly how these things are going to roll out. We want to make the decision. We want to have a say on that, and they use their labor power in order to bargain for it. And I think that's a great example that these things can be done, that rules can be set, that we ultimately have the decision at the end of the day, not the Sam Altmans and the Elon Musks of the world. So, thank you so much.